Okay, so hey everyone, we're going to get started. Hi there, my name is Zainab Ahmed. I will be chairing this talk with some absolute luminaries, like if I may say so myself, of the Irish abortion movement. Like the way this is going to be structured is I'll give a brief background to some of the material, then we're going to go from Helen Stonehouse to Naomi Connor to Mairead, and then after that, like we're going to have some prepared questions, and then I'm going to take questions from the audience. And I'm really looking forward to what I'm sure will be an excellent discussion. Like, firstly, I want to start by briefly going over some of the terminology that we're going to be using. So I want to specifically talk about the word imperialism. Imperialism means a lot of things to a lot of different people. Especially in a British context, you hear imperialism being used in reference to a variety of different subject matter. In the context of this talk, so we're talking about British imperialism in Ireland, which itself has a really rich and complex history. It includes a lot of different institutions that I'm not going to be able to get into all of them, right? Like they're various though, right? You could be talking about the English crown, you could be talking about the Catholic Church, and the complexity of the issue is that these different imperial institutions also have complex relationships with each other. They have complex relationships with different people and institutions within Ireland itself. Often imperialism is talked about in a really black and white way. You know what I mean? Like where you just have a bunch of like English people just show up with knives or something and then force everybody to do something. The reality is never that simple, right? Like the way that imperialism operates involves a wide variety of people who are very diverse and direct themselves towards all sorts of different objectives. And sometimes those objectives actually contradict each other. Like there are no easy answers to the question of empire is my soundbite of the evening. So for this talk, imperialism refers to military policy and the political and economic institutional requirements for Ireland to be slotted into the world capitalist economy over the past like a few centuries, right? So that includes a lot of different kinds of policies. And abortion policy specifically, this is a talk at the Learning Co-operative. We've been doing a series called Abortion and Empire. What I say before every talk, as I did before the last talk on xenophobia and US-China imperial competition, is that abortion policy overlaps with imperial efforts to lay out and maintain strict definitions of sexual activity, family, and household. And often those reflect different imperial ambitions. As I said, those imperial ambitions could compete. One of the things that I've been dealing with in my own research in Afghanistan and Pakistan is that occasionally you'll have an LGBT and queer framing of like how to lay out the family structure in these places, right? And it competes with the classical imperial framing, which is that you just need like man, woman, two parent households, right? Like, as I said, this stuff isn't really simple, and you shouldn't mislead yourself into thinking it's simple. If it was simple, there wouldn't be imperialism anymore. Everything would be gone, right? Like the fact that it's complicated, it partially explains why imperialism has lasted as long as it has. And the example that I usually give when I'm doing stuff like that is the Greek root word of the word economics. So economics is rooted in a Greek word called oikonomos, right? And the root of that is oikos. Oikos means house or household, right? So that is to say that since the time of Aristotle, really, because Aristotle uses this word, the home and its internal goings on have been seen as like the basic building block unit of the economy at large, and the basic building block unit of state administration at large, right? Ancient Greece didn't have like modern states, right? But there was still a notion that you have a household, which is the basic unit that you're working with, right? And then society is like a collection of different households in that vision of society, right? So with that, we can make larger claims about why modern European statecraft, definitely since the 18th and 19th centuries, and why modern European imperialism have been so interested in maintaining the household structure and have been so interested in policing what the household means, right? So, basic soundbite. Abortion law is really about structuring sexual activity and its purpose, and that includes the family and its various norms. So that's it for imperialism for now. Like, so why abortion and imperialism in Ireland, right? That's the title of this talk. So I want to give a little bit of backstory of Irish abortion law as it's evolved over the past 150 years. Shockingly, me doing this in 2 minutes is going to leave a lot of stuff out. Like, but I'm hoping that it will lay the foundations for a larger discussion with our panelists. So, abortion was banned in Ireland, the whole island of Ireland, but like more formally, like although there were taboos and unofficial bans since then, but in terms of modern legal institutions, you have the 1861 Offences Against the Person Act, which was passed in Westminster. Now, why did this happen in 1861? Well, the 1860s were a general period of imperial reorganizing following notable uprisings in Montego Bay, India, Ireland itself, and so on, right? And the 19th century was also a point since the Napoleonic Wars that Britain became more and more ambitious with what it could do in its colonies. So you have a couple of different things going on, like into the first legal and institutional regulations of abortion as part of this much larger act that's called the Offences Against the Person Act, right? Like, I will say, as an aside, relevant to my own research, although Afghanistan was not technically part of British India, abortion was banned in British India by the Imperial Legislative Council in 1860. So as you can see, like 1861 is this law that applies to the United Kingdom of Great Britain and the entirety of the island of Ireland. Sorry, those are similar words. But you also have another, like almost exactly the same law being passed by the Legislative Council responsible for British India in 1860. So abortion wasn't just an imperial story, it was a planetary story from the very beginning, right? Like if we talk about abortion and empire as though it's like a new thing, like we're overlooking the history of how abortion actually became to be outlawed in much of the world, right? It came to be outlawed through the institutions of European imperialism. If you want to look into the history of how abortion was banned in various different countries in Western Africa, for example, you're going to have to end up with a discussion of the French Empire, right? Because the French Empire is the one that did it, right? Like, focusing more specifically on Ireland. So in 1922, jumping ahead, following the Irish War of Independence, most of Ireland separated from the United Kingdom, and this eventual Republic of Ireland kept the 1860 ban with a Catholic framing, and the Catholic Church was really involved in legitimizing the 1860 ban to the majority of the Irish population. Critically, it was still the 1860 ban in Westminster. So you have like an interesting sort of situation going on, right? It would be inappropriate to see this as a Catholics versus Protestant thing, right? Because both Catholic and Protestant institutions are involved in the laws in Ireland that are govern abortion. Like, and then so jumping ahead to 1983, obviously a lot of things happen in 60 years, but like just to give this some backstory. The Eighth Amendment to the Republic of Ireland's Constitution came into effect. The Eighth Amendment equalized rights between the unborn child and the pregnant person. Later amendments in the Republic of Ireland made it easier to travel for abortions and get them elsewhere. And then, as some of you probably know, the 36th Amendment of the ROI Constitution came into effect in May 2018, and that repealed the earlier 8th Amendment that was passed in 1983. So that's the Republic of Ireland as the foundation for the talk. Now into the northern 6 counties. So what happened was that in 1922, following the Irish War of Independence, the northern 6 counties of the overall island of Ireland separated off from the rest of the Republic of Ireland. These were 6 counties with significant Irish Protestant populations, and they stayed with the United Kingdom. The 1945 Criminal Justice Act of Northern Ireland defined a fetus of any age as a person. British abortion law continued to progress generally. In 1967, Westminster passed the Abortion Act of 1967, but because of legal issues with Northern Ireland technically had a legally devolved assembly that could choose different laws. Northern Ireland's assembly chose not to pass the 1967 abortion law that was passed in Westminster. And over subsequent decades, women would often, well, we should say pregnant people, that's my mistake. Pregnant people would often travel to the rest of the United Kingdom if they wanted to get abortions. There's a lot of complexity to how this happened, right? But I want you to kind of get the basics down. Basically, what happened more recently, as some of you know, that this is no longer the case. What happened recently is that the devolved assembly at Stormont fell apart. There were a lot of different things going on, like a debate about language and so on. And then this created a situation where Westminster could impose a direct rule statute. And what happened was that MPs attached a couple of different things to the direct rule statute, including a regulation on LGBT and marriage, as well as a partial repeal of the Offences Against the Person Act of 1861, that would effectively bring Northern Ireland legally in sync with what has been true in the rest of the United Kingdom. Then different parties in Northern Ireland basically just ran out the clock, and then on October 21st, 2019, news broke that officially, as would be implemented in the next year, the previous abortion regime, anti-abortion regime in Northern Ireland was no longer the case due to this partial repeal. As I say, imperialism is complicated, right? Because you have a situation here where technically what's happened is that Westminster has adopted direct rule in Northern Ireland, but the act of doing that ends up doing something that is opposite to the earlier act that was passed by Westminster in 1861. This stuff is complicated, and there are various different complexities to how the law is used in these cases, right? Personally, my position as a result of this is that abortion law in general needs to be critically questioned, right? Because if it can change around this drastically, and if different countries in the world are effectively working with the fragments of a prior era of imperial rule, then you really need to reflect on why the law is being used this way in the first place, right? That's part of the reason why I brought these panelists together as part of the Learning Co-operative. So very briefly before we get started, I also want to tell you all, this talk is being hosted in conjunction with Reprocare. That is a charity that I'm working with in the United States. Reprocare operates a health line that gives people emotional support as it relates to medication based abortions. And Reprocare is always looking for donations and always looking for your input. please go to reprocare.com if you're curious about Reprocare's work as it relates to the rest of the United States, like, the United States. And I know that many of you are in the United States, and I would encourage you to check out Reprocare and look at some of our activities as they evolve in the coming year. Okay, so that's it for me. So we're going to go now to Helen Stonehouse. Helen is one of the co-conveners of the Abortion Rights Campaign. In the past few years, she's contributed to submissions around the Citizens Assembly and subsequent abortion legislation, as well as canvassing for the organization Repeal Together for Yes. Helen is also a parent and an early years educator, providing behavioral and communication support for kids with additional needs. Helen, we're pleased to have you, and please take this away from me.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm going to apologize to everyone in advance because I agreed to do this yesterday after my colleague fell ill, and my notes have been written in between minding a toddler. So I apologize if anything is a little bit frenetic. Please just forgive me. So as I say, I'm going to tell you a little bit about ARC and the Abortion Rights Campaign, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the abortion legislation that we have in Ireland right now, and some of the problems with it, and how that kind of relates into stuff. So I'm from ARC, which is the Abortion Rights Campaign. We were founded in July 2012, and we campaign for the free, safe, and legal and local access to abortion across the island of Ireland. We are a grassroots feminist network, and we strive to be intersectional and non-hierarchical in our organizing. Just to give you an idea of some of the things that we do, we organize the March for Choice. Every year in Dublin, we organize speak outs, which are safe places for people to come and discuss their abortion experiences. We do various visibility actions across the country, although obviously less so during the pandemic. We also run values clarification and civic engagement trainings, which gives people places to discuss abortion and discuss their ideas around abortion and develop their stance on it. And then also give them the skills to talk to politicians or elected representatives about abortion and about campaigning for better access. Prior to the referendum, we developed a network of regional groups across the country and held open meetings and information stalls in lots of different places, many of which were initially hostile to having an open public space for talking about abortion. A lot of these regional groups then turned into canvassing groups during the referendum. And during the referendum, we were 1/3 of Together for Yes, which was the official campaign, I suppose, to repeal the 8th Amendment, along with the coalition to repeal the 8th and the National Women's Council. Both before and after the referendum, we've engaged with government processes around abortion. So whether that's the Citizens Assembly or the Joint Oireachtas Committee processes that came prior to it. But we also engage with processes around things like direct provision, relationships and sexuality education, and gender equality. Basically, if there's even a slight relationship towards reproductive rights, I will write a submission and send it in and annoy some TDs. That's pretty much what we do. We can make anything about abortion if we try hard enough. We also have engaged with a number of UN treaty bodies, again, not specifically about things that you might always think can relate to abortion. We've spoken in front of CEDAW, which is the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, but we've also sent submissions into CERD, which is the Committee for Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the CAT, which is the Convention Against Torture, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child, because again, all of these issues of reproductive rights, different people in different sectors of society have different experiences of it and are subject to abortion legislation in different ways. And we think that's important because it also brings abortion into being a human rights issue, as well as it's not just a healthcare issue. We also support Alliance for Choice over there, work towards getting action in Northern Ireland. And I know that Naomi will talk to you more about what Alliance does. We've also done various bits of solidarity and support with other countries which are struggling with abortion access, such as Argentina and Poland, Some of our wonderful activists from Leitrim have gone in person to visit in Malta and Gibraltar, as they've been trying to work towards getting legalizing abortion there as well. So obviously we're now in a pandemic, and so obviously what our activism looks like has really changed, which is why we're all sitting in our homes right now chatting to you. But we are still trying to push forward access as much as possible. During the pandemic, we've advocated for telemedicine access for abortion, and we've tried to organize, well, we've also advocated for continuity of care for people who have failed medical abortions, because people are still traveling from Ireland to the UK to access abortion, even during a pandemic, which is a phenomenal failure of public health. And in 2021, very excitingly, there may be a review of our abortion legislation, there should be a review of our abortion legislation. We don't know exactly yet what that's going to look like, but we're starting to organize around that as well. And part of what we're doing is we've developed a survey to understand what access looks like for different people. So we're conducting some research on that at the moment, which is very exciting. So that's a little bit about who we are, I guess, and what we do. So I guess to talk about the legislation as it stands right now, as Zainab has said, the 8th Amendment was repealed, which is super awesome, and the Irish government legislated for abortion access. It's not, I know that Mairead is a legal scholar, so I'm not going to defer questions for her. I'll cover the basics and then she can make it much more complicated for you. One of the massive issues that we have with our abortion legislation as it stands is that it really doesn't frame abortion as a necessary part of healthcare or as part of a right to a bodily autonomy. It frames abortion as a necessary evil that has to be contained and treated in particular ways. Abortion under specific set circumstances is okay. Abortion in any other circumstances is not. Part of that comes in the way that abortion is criminalized outside of the strictures of the law, so that anyone who assists in or performs an abortion outside of those is subject to a 14-year criminal penalty. We also have quite strict gestational limits for on-request access to abortion, which is first trimester, 12 weeks LMP. Additionally, we have a 3-day waiting period to access abortion right now. So if you want to access an abortion, you go to your doctor, you tell them you would like an abortion, you go away for 3 whole days and come back. And at that point, an abortion may be performed, which is, as I'm sure you can imagine, completely medically unnecessary, as well as obviously being paternalistic and wholly patronizing and misogynistic in its execution. For any access post 12 weeks, so after the first trimester, our regulations are quite strict. The access grounds are risk of serious harm to health or life, fetal abnormality that will result in death during or shortly after birth, and shortly after is even defined as 28 days after birth. A lot of these concepts aren't based in medical evidence, but because they're written into law and because they're coupled with a criminalization penalty, it means that doctors are quite conservative in their interpretation of those laws. So we know, for example, from our colleagues in TFMR, which is termination for medical reasons, that although that people are traveling to the United Kingdom to access abortion in the case of a fetal abnormality there, but when they're speaking to those doctors in the UK, they're being told that they should have been entitled to an abortion in Ireland because there was absolutely no chance of fetal survival. And when we look at the numbers of people who have accessed abortion since it's been legal, what we find is that after 12 weeks, so if anyone is having a second or third trimester abortion, the numbers are roughly the same as they were before the 8th Amendment was repealed, which just indicates that really it's not functioning in many ways. And that includes as well for fatal fetal abnormalities, 100 people accessed it in Ireland, but also 65 people had to travel to the UK to access it. So clearly we're still not meeting the needs of our people. And we are actually also still, as I say, sending people to travel. As well as that, there are a couple of other kind of issues with specifically with the legislation. The legislation has gendered language, so it exclusively refers to women throughout. And obviously this excludes trans, non-binary and intersex people. And these are people who are already marginalized in our healthcare service and in our society. And then this law, in addition, continues to marginalize their access. We don't have a huge amount of information on what impact this has actually had on access yet. This is something that we're kind of currently researching and we hope to find out more about. before the legislation is reviewed. And the last thing I have is that our legislation also has a refusal of care on conscientious objection grounds. So it means that a GP or a doctor can refuse to give you an abortion if they disagree with abortion. We know in other jurisdictions, particularly in Italy, that this has been a major barrier towards people accessing care. In Italy, a significant number of medical providers are what you would call objectors on basis of convenience rather than conscience, in the sense that it is simply not worth their effort to provide abortion. We don't know the extent to which that's reflected here. A lot of GP service, a lot of early medical abortion is provided through GPs, and we know that only 15% of Irish GPs have signed up to provide that service, and roughly half of those will only provide it to pre-existing patients. And additionally, not all of our maternity hospitals will provide abortions. I think it's currently 11 out of our 19. And we know that there are specific areas where there is little or no services. For example, Sligo has absolutely no GP-based services at all. And we know of other counties where there are very few services and it's very limited. So obviously all of these kind of barriers add up to a very difficult situation. I think that what we see about the kind of current legislation situation and the current access situation is that when it works great, and people can access abortion, and that's brilliant. But that all of these barriers that exist in the legislation form real barriers in real life access. And obviously all of these barriers are excuse me, sorry, can't put my teeth in, I'm going to take a sip of water. It's been a long day of chasing a toddler. All of these barriers are even greater for people who are already marginalized by our healthcare service and our society. So if you're already marginalized because of your race, your class, your language, your disability, your immigration status, then you're going to find it even harder to access. If you think about issues like the 3-day waiting period, if you can't afford to take time off work for one appointment, then you also can't afford to take time off work for 2 appointments and to wait 3 days in the middle in order to access your services. And again, you know, in terms of migration status and so on and so forth. I always think of a story from Isolde Carmody, who's a disabled writer and activist from Leitrim, and she said it would be easier for her to travel to Liverpool to access an abortion than it would for her to get herself to Sligo General to access an abortion instead. So we see that all of these things are still there, and we are still reliant on the UK for a huge number of our abortion services. We know people are still traveling there, even though people are still accessing abortion here. So yeah, that's pretty much what I've got. I think that's it. I'm going to hand back to Zainab, who's going to hand you back over to someone else. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Helen. And just to tell you, we are all very pro-toddler here, so don't worry about that. I'm going to hand this over to Naomi right now. So Naomi Connor is one of the co-conveners for Alliance for Choice. It's a grassroots organization in favor of abortion in Northern Ireland. She's based in Belfast and has been an outspoken advocate for pregnant people and their abortion needs in Northern Ireland, based partially on personal experience. Naomi, take it.
Thank you. Thank you, Zainab. What I'll do, I'll not sort of rehearse everything that Alliance for Choice do. Suffice to say that Helen has given a really rounded picture, and that's what we do in the north of Ireland. And of course, we have a great relationship with ARC and with our sisters and siblings internationally, and do all the things that you would expect in terms of activities around protest and indeed progress as well. I am not going to pretend to be an academic. I'm not at all. I'm going to speak as an activist, and I'm also going to speak as someone who was forced to travel from Northern Ireland to Manchester, mainland UK, in order to access abortion services and the right to my own bodily autonomy. And really that was a catalyst into abortion activism for me. In terms of the question of abortion and empire, which is what I'm sort of trying to speak to tonight, and I'm certainly no expert on it, but it's not really the immediate go-to place that abortion activists, would think about straight away. But when talking about abortion rights, abortion access, and specifically abortion justice, which is which is really important to have discussions around, because as we know, stigma is much of the prevailing problem when it comes to abortion and accessing it. It does matter in the struggle for all reproductive rights, that we discuss empire and we discuss the history of the repression of sexual freedoms and abortion rights. And I think abortion and empire remains today pervasively disruptive when it comes to accessing abortion, autonomy, and indeed any form of self-determination as a woman or pregnant person. So when we looked at empire historically, globally, not just in Ireland, but globally and historically, if we look back at the empires that we're all familiar with, that we were all taught about in school, such as the Roman Empire, the Greek Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, whatever it was, fundamentally those societies were not opposed to abortion. Okay, it wasn't seen as the moral and ethical question that it is now. There were objections around abortion, but they were minimized, and they were really more to do with patriarchy, which is of course at the heart of empire, but it was around men who wanted sons and heirs rather than any sort of idea of, you know, what womanhood itself should look like. And as Zainab had said, you know, philosophers such as Aristotle and you know, the philosophers, the sort of that we would know in everyday speak, they asserted, as did many others, that an embryo was simply an embryo up until between 40 and 80 days into pregnancy, when the fetus, you know, started to move and could be felt. And in Western history and societies as well, abortion wasn't a crime if it was carried out before what is referred to as the quickening, which is really a period from about 18 weeks onward, where again movement is felt, and that really carried. It didn't really carry a sort of, it didn't present as a great ethical and moral question. As Zainab has pointed out in framing the question around abortion and empire, English law has changed, you know, in different ways since the 1800s. And really with the case of R versus Bourne, which came about in England in 1938 and in America in 1973 with Roe versus Wade, that those cases established they were landmark cases that established the sort of framework, the legal framework for how abortion came about in the UK and in Ireland. I sort of looked at texts when I'm talking about abortion in this light, such as Caliban and the Witch, because that goes back even further, and that traces sort of how abortion came to be oppressed back to the rise of capitalism, and women's intrusion as it was seen by the patriarchy into public life. So women's intrusion into health, you know, into having a say in society as healers, you know, as sages, as medics, as whatever it was. And that really meant women became more powerful, women had voices, and that, you know, that couldn't be the case. And that really is reflected in many of the sort of pushes, the push back from the anti-choice lobby, and really from right-wing reactionaries against modern day abortion healthcare. It really comes from that same place that Federici described in those texts. So the answer, I suppose, does that mean that empire and colonialism no longer have a negative impact on the provision of abortion in society? And the reality is they absolutely do have an influence. and that has to be stated and that has to be said. In Northern Ireland, just coming to the question of Northern Ireland, prior to decriminalisation, as Zainab has pointed out, we had a piece of legislation that governed us, and it was an empirical piece of legislation, and that was the 1861 Offences Against the Person Act. And that was a piece of legislation which came about before the invention of the light bulb. So really that had to go. But we didn't want it replaced in Alliance for Choice and you know, in campaigning organisations with the 1967 Abortion Act in the UK, because the 1967 Abortion Act in the UK, whilst it still prevails and whilst it enabled abortions in the main, still operates in a criminal framework. It doesn't operate in a healthcare framework as it should. It still is criminalised in the rest of the UK. So it's an exceptional piece of legislation rather than a piece of legislation which was rolled out to provide abortion as healthcare. So in terms of what we have in Northern Ireland, yes, we have abortion decriminalised after decades of women and pregnant people travelling, after decades of unsafe abortion, and decades of oppression. But the difficulty at the minute in Northern Ireland is not in and around the legislation, which is there, which is present, which is CEDAW, which is based around CEDAW, the Committee for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. That's a UN committee. What we have at the minute is a disruption by paternalistic, by pro-unionists, and what would historically be seen as pro-empire parties to access to abortion. So we have no commissioning of services in Northern Ireland, despite the fact that abortion is decriminalised and an abortion regulatory framework is present. So what that means is the Health Minister for Northern Ireland has stated categorically and repeatedly that he will not commission services in Northern Ireland. So abortion services will receive no funding. Abortion services are not publicly advertised. There is no public information. And despite the fact the legislation says that abortions can take place at certain gestations with certain conditionality up to birth, that is not being provided for. Some trusts, and what I mean by trusts are health trusts, have rolled out what abortion services they can, but the pathway to abortion is reliant on a charity, which is called Informed Choices NI, and in reality, early medical abortion is only available up to 9 weeks, 6 days. The rest of women and pregnant people still have to travel to England. Some will travel to other health trusts. Surgical abortions, the picture is very patchy and unclear. So in reality, the law has not delivered the abortion framework and the abortion service provision and the abortion justice that we require. Now, strangely, the Democratic Unionist Party, who have said would have been viewed as a pro-empire party and the largest party in Northern Ireland, were not in favour of the 1967, of the extension of the 1967 Act, or obviously the most recent changes to abortion legislation in Northern Ireland. They vehemently opposed it, and they still do. You know, they've tried all sorts of parliamentary stunts in order to stymie the legislation. But as much as that contradicts their pro-empire and their pro-unionist stance, it shows that, as Zainab has said, the church and the state are very heavily wed when it comes to this oppression, because there is a deep-rooted fundamentalism in the DUP's assertion. Now, it's not just the DUP, there are others as well, but it's the DUP in the main who are vocal about this, and as the largest party they do have considerable sway. But there is a religious fundamentalism which is tied intrinsically to the state in Northern Ireland, and that complicates things very much. And there's also this complacency sometimes that when you have an abortion law, it's fine, that the job is done. And that is just simply not the case. And also, when you have an abortion law, it can't be undone. And it can, and there are more ways to do it than simply removing the legislation. So if you look at the sort of the trickle-down effect that Trump has had on the global reproductive picture, and the fact that not long after he got into office, he brought about the global gag rule. He resurrected that from sort of Reagan's time, and he signed the order which banned international NGOs from providing reproductive health care. He essentially stymied the funding and banned NGOs from providing health care where they provided extensively to developing countries. So what that meant is, you know, that is another form of empire, this time the US empire, really robbing, where historically other empires robbed Africa, Asia, and countries, you know, such as that, of their land, their resources, their people, you know, their freedom. The removal of those global health efforts are also robbing people of their access to healthcare, and that will only have the effect of adding to the 25 million unsafe abortions that happen every year, that predominantly happen in Asia, Africa, and indeed Latin America. So empire is still very, very much present in those countries, and here, and manifests in different ways, and that's very much economically. I do have to talk about our own economic system and capitalism, because it's built on empire and it has a bloody history of controlling women's bodies. There's no escaping that. But when women and pregnant people continue to be treated in accordance with the dominant narrative of white male privilege. And I read a book recently which was called Conscientious Knowledge, which was by a writer called Mina Salome. And she refers to this as the Euro-patriarchy. And that is very much the DUP are the living embodiment of the Euro-patriarchy, it has to be said. And whilst there's nothing to be said really positive about the structures of imperialism, elitism, and patriarchy when it comes to abortion, science, you know, scientific, industrial, and information revolutions are lauded by the patriarchy as huge strides forward. Okay, the patriarchy will claim those and will say that all these things are progress, all these things are good, we're leaving behind the old world in favour of this new world order. But that is where the juxtaposition happens, and that those ideals from the patriarchy's point of view clash with capitalism's idea of the woman as a baby maker, as a child rearer, as you know, a domestic goddess, and something has to be done about that. So you can't apply, you know, all the advances to women, because that means that women would be free to make their own choices, and at the end of the day, capitalism is dependent on women's labour to produce labour, on which capitalism rests. And a woman who makes her own choices, a pregnant person who makes their own choices, who presents as someone who is unproductive, is a resistance to capitalism. That is the ultimate resistance to capitalism. And I think no one has put it better than Federici herself when she said the human body, and not the steam engine, not even the clock, was the first machine developed by capitalism. And really that falls to women and pregnant people, and they bear the brunt of that oppression. So at the same time, you know, women are referred to in much of Northern Ireland's policy documents as economically inactive, women who don't work, or women who aren't credited with their domestic labour. Austerity, when it's seen through a gendered lens, has impacted women and marginalised groups predominantly. Childcare is unaffordable. So really, patriarchy and capitalism have the deck stacked, and they operate in a sphere of reproductive value creation. And that's why sexual freedoms, sexual health, bodily autonomy, abortion, this notion of a woman as not a vessel, not an incubator, is such a threat to empire and such a threat to capitalism. So I think in Northern Ireland, there are sort of, I mean, I'll answer more in the, if people want specifics in Northern Ireland in and around this, what's happening in terms of resistance. But I think we have to look at that, and we have to look at ways to resist which operate outside those patriarchal structures. And those are the things that have worked best when it comes to tackling it. So a bit like Zainab has described, we've started a doula programme in Northern Ireland, which we're rolling out at present, which is basically a way of saying, fuck you, we're going to do this anyway. If you're not going to provide the healthcare, the support, and everything that goes with it, we're going to do it anyway, and we don't care what you say. In the same way we were giving women pills for years so that they could get access to safe abortion. We are very, very fixed on the projection of women and pregnant people's voices from a grassroots point of view, because when you present an anti-choicer with a woman who has had an abortion, or a pregnant person who has had an abortion, they really don't know what to do with her. And that fucks the patriarchy up, and they don't know what to do because it's not within their structures. And also we draw on things like the Me Too movement and the fact that that was that had a huge reach, and that was a global phenomenon. So when we look at our ways to tackle this, I think we reflect a lot on, you know, people like Audre Lorde, you know, and who in her famous essay said the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house. And I think that gives us some hope, some optimism, and something to strive towards when we're talking about the idea of abortion and empire. And I'm just going to end with a quick quote from, I think it was actually a chant that Italian feminists came up with in the 1970s when they were protesting on this issue. And they said, "Tremble, tremble, the witches have returned."
That's great. Thank you very much for that, Naomi. What I'll just say at this point, is that I want just a couple of things here. If you go into the chat, everyone, you will find a Donately link through a bit.ly. I'm just posting it again now. That'll take you to Reprocare's donation page, in the spirit of telling everybody to fuck off and that abortions will be done by the people who need them and the people who support them. Feel free to donate generously. That's one thing. The other thing is that there have been a couple of questions about the Holy Roman Empire and the Ottomans as well. We're going to be addressing that stuff after the next speaker. I'm just going to take 30 seconds just to answer what I can, since I pretend to be an academic, so Naomi doesn't need to. And I will give this over to Mairead now. Mairead, I'm very happy to have you, and take it from here.
Thanks very much. I'm not going to talk about the detail of the law, actually, because I haven't been thinking about abortion law for a week. Anyway, I've been thinking quite intensely about something else, so I might get the law wrong. But what I thought it might be useful to do was maybe just to end the discussion by flagging up some traces of coloniality in abortion law, kind of north and south, in very brief ways. I'm not going to theorize them. I'm just going to throw out some headings and then we can kind of have the conversation. It's an interesting time on the island of Ireland, I suppose, because certainly the government in the Republic is engaged in a lot of commemorative work. And this is the centenary year of the sort of creation of Northern Ireland as well. There's a lot of public history being done, or a lot of official history, and a lot of resistance to official history, thinking about how these jurisdictions, how these states came into being. So this is a really kind of fertile time to be thinking about our relationships to coloniality and its sort of long aftermath. So the first thing is kind of, as we said at the beginning, both jurisdictions until quite recently, our shared abortion law, although it was applied in different jurisdictions and in different courts, was the 1861 Offences Against the Person Act. That abortion was criminalised in both jurisdictions until very recently. And there's still some residual criminalisation, and that it wasn't until 2013 that changed in the Republic, and then very recently in the North. And it's not just that the law came from Britain, but that the law was part of a broader, what Jim Smith at Boston College calls an architecture of containment, going back to the point that Naomi made about capitalism and the need to control reproductive function and the need to control family form. Abortions, such as they were in the 1860s, were part of a network of control mechanisms, which we've been thinking a lot about in the Republic in the last week because of the publication of the Mother and Baby Homes Commission Investigation Report. And there are similar, it's one of a series of state investigations, and there have been similar investigations in the North, right? The abortion law was part of a network of control, which included things like the poor law with its workhouses and its industrial schools for the children of the poor and the children of unmarried mothers, and its mother and baby homes for the containment of new babies who had been born to unmarried mothers and their dispersal either into the so-called care system or into other families and households via forced adoption, child migration, and so on. Another feature of that system, of course, was the reliance on religious organizations for welfare provision, which persists as a feature of life in both states, perhaps more strongly in the Republic, but certainly in both states. And the imperial strength, of course, of the Catholic Church, the manifestation of that imperial strength in the Republic, is part of its hand-in-glove relationship with British colonialism. It's part of the concessions that the British Empire made to Irish home rulers in the 19th century was to soften its grasp on the church and its grasp on the church's wealth. And so particularly in the latter part of the 19th century, you see huge sort of building, funding, welfare institution building by the Catholic Church in the Republic. And you can go to any city, any town in Ireland today and still see those buildings, see how that movement dominates the landscape. And the third kind of feature of that colonial landscape, which leaves sort of traces on our law today, is the power of the sort of British medical model. A very masculinist model. We know something about the history of abortion regulation, the need to take abortion and its associated practices of infanticide or stopping pregnancy before the point of quickening and so on, to take that back from midwives and handy women to bring it into the developing Victorian hospital, to use it as a sort of a boundary struggle around professional autonomy. And that is taking place at the same time as across the island of Ireland, there's a huge investment of energy in the control of sex work and its supposed association with disease. And there is a huge blurring of the lines between control of reproductive function and criminality generally. It's not just the criminalization of abortion, it's regulations around stillbirth and burials, it's regulation of sex work and so on. This isn't just an Irish experience, of course, and there are still countries in the world which have remnants of the 1861 Act and which, like the Republic of Ireland, decided to keep the 1861 Act even after their independence movements were successful. The relationship between religion and the state needs a little bit more elaboration. It's different in the north and the south, because of, you know, the sort of basic principle of political power that Zainab set out at the start, that there was a larger Protestant population in the north than in the south, and that became the boundary for the sort of rough violence of partition just before 1922. In Northern Ireland, you see, and you still see today, even in the recent decriminalisation of abortion in the north, you see this use of religion as a means to define community in a very binary way, where you're either one or the other. Religion is a way, or religious identity is a way in which to mediate local power, and it's also a way in which to give sort of sops to sort of comprador classes within Northern Ireland, right? You can't control everything, but you can control certain things, and you can control them on the basis of your Protestant masculinity, for example. In the South, things are more and less complex. A friend of mine this week, the poet Sarah Clancy, taught me a new phrase, which is theo-capitalist necrostate. So that's what the Republic of Ireland becomes. This, and the necrostate part is just because of the number of people who die in church institutions in the Irish Free State and the Irish Republic. The Irish Free State in particular put a lot of energy into identifying the state as a Catholic state, into satisfying certain diplomatic relations with the Vatican, into satisfying certain internal relations with church leaders on its own territory. In the early years of the Free State, when the Free State doesn't have very much money or power, huge power goes to the Catholic Church for welfare provision. This isn't just because the state doesn't have enough money to do it itself, but because privatization of welfare provision in that way is consistent with Catholic teaching. Some of the first laws that the Free State passes, because it doesn't have the resources to regulate much else, have to do with women's sexual behaviour. So even though women are very involved in the independence movement, the state puts a lot of time and effort into getting them back in the house, back in the kitchen, and starts to ban basically anything women might enjoy: cinema, dancing, drinking, and contraception, sex. All of these things become the subject of a massive legislative programme at the start of the 1920s. And there is the state, you know, in particular the political party which was in charge for the majority of that period, and which is still in government today in a different form, you know, is regulating the country in a way that is also happening in Italy and Spain and so on. You know, it's very pro-natalist. It has, if we don't want to say it's explicitly fascist, it certainly has fascist overtones. And women are left in no doubt that they're, by either church or state, that their duty is to be virtuous mothers and to produce children for the state, irrespective of the fact that the state can't feed them or employ them, and they are being raised up for emigration to elsewhere within the wider British Empire and its current or former protectorates and territories, right? In 1983, famously, Ireland uses its constitution to introduce a radical new ban on abortion. And this is part of an almost total ban. It's not just that there's an exception in cases where the woman's life is at risk. There must be a degree of certainty about that risk to her life, and there must be no other way of ending it except to end the pregnancy. So it's very, very tight. The constitution is this weird thing in that moment, right? Because first of all, it's the symbol of independence and freedom, right? It's this special document that we've created to lay down our distinctly non-British values or whatever, right? But at the same time, it is this instrument of sort of fetal-centric nationalism, and we'll soft pedal the nationalism because what we know about the history of how that that part was entered into the constitution is that it was partly an American experiment. It was an experiment between Irish pro-lifers and their kind of American paymasters who themselves were interested in putting a fetal life provision into the United States Constitution. Were unsuccessful on several occasions, though they were successful maybe at state level, and used Ireland as a petri dish for trying that out. And so Ireland was one of the first countries to have that kind of fetal life provision in its constitution in the world. I think maybe Chile or Argentina got there before us, but their constitutional structure isn't quite the same. So, so that is where often when we talk about that kind of high point of the Catholic state in Ireland, that moment, 1983, is very important because the women's movement had been making some headway. The formerly very strict law on contraception had been liberalized and so on. Women were starting to, after we joined the EU in particular, there were some real strides made for women's equality. And the successful passage of the 1983 referendum was a real moment of violence and despair for the women's movement. And it's not exaggeration to say that lots of people who were involved in the women's movement left the country because it was such a moment of profound despair. But the other thing to say about Catholicism in the later period in Ireland, in the 20th century, is to go back to that point about the relationship between the religious and the secular, right? Not all the doctors and nurses and managers in those welfare institutions are priests and nuns, right? But they have been educated by and benefit from the patronage of the formal church. And we still are living with, both in Northern Ireland and in the Republic of Ireland, we're living with that quasi-colonial, quasi-religious deference to professional power. And as both Helen and Naomi have pointed out, that is one of the sticking points, even in this moment when our law has changed quite radically. Doctors, people in the health service, people in the professions, lawyers, many have, if not direct sort of personal commitment to Catholic values, will defer to them or believe that they are deserving of protection, even to the extent of trumping other people's rights. And that is something that we are struggling with in both jurisdictions. So even though, the Republic is very proud of its secularization, that secularization is piecemeal and it happens in different parts of the structure at different times. And so there is something going on there around professional autonomy, the duties of doctors, conscientious objection, and so on. Maybe just in terms of the other thing, obviously, is partition. We're two different jurisdictions, but more important than partition, I think, to abortion law, specifically to abortion law, is the stuff Naomi has been talking about in terms of having to go to Westminster and the difficulties of going to Westminster. And certainly there is a discourse in Britain that says weren't we great to give Northern Irish women their rights? And that's not what it looks like from in here, I'm speaking from Birmingham, but from the island in my head, that's not what it looks like from in here, right? Birmingham's half Irish anyway. It was very interesting to us to see how British feminists in power speak about Ireland and speak in particular about Northern Ireland. It was remarkable how their interest in solving this problem grew in the context of Brexit, which of course, as people like Nadine and Anani have pointed out, Brexit is hopefully the last sting of the dying wasp of empire. And in that moment when liberals are becoming concerned about what is happening on the right and the DUP have their case to answer for Brexit and so on, the possibility of dealing with the Northern Irish abortion question becomes a stick to smack the DUP with and suddenly becomes much more interesting. And that's not just a smart remark, that is consistent with the treatment of Northern Ireland and the Northern Irish abortion issue over the last, since 1967. People like Goretti Horgan have documented this in huge detail. There is, that thing I said earlier about letting notional communities govern their women, which is a classic sort of colonial governmental technique. There's a real reluctance to burst that bubble. It took an awful lot to convince people to do it. And it was interesting how far they would go, because the Alliance for Choice not always, but by most recently, in the last decade certainly, the Alliance for Choice were saying, we don't want the 1967 Act. The 1967 Act is out of date. The 1967 Act is too restrictive. We want you to just repeal your law and let us get on with it, right? But you couldn't have a situation where Northern Ireland had a better abortion law than the mainland. And at the same time as Northern Ireland was asking for this change, other feminists within Britain were asking that the 1967 Act, that the 50-year anniversary of the 67 Act in 2017, they were saying that was the perfect moment to finally decriminalise abortion in England and Wales and Scotland. And that still has not been achieved. That is still on the back burner. So there's something there about that colonial subjectivity. We're happy to decide for you if it's convenient for us, but we're certainly not going to learn from you, and we're certainly not going to let you drive the agenda. And that was really visible. Maybe the last thing to say is about travel and mobility. So there's two things there. First of all, the expectation of mobility is part of colonization. The expectation that as long as what you need or where we need you to be or where we can provide for you, as long as that is somewhere, you just have to go there, right? And that's what happened with abortion. And that's what happened with abortion travel to Britain. That expectation that you'll just have to travel for it, I think, had been internalized in Ireland. If you want it, if you want to make that choice that's not consistent with our values, Britain's only next door. It's up to you to get yourself there, and that's provision enough. That's good enough. And that was a very difficult argument, first of all, to expose, and second of all, to get people to accept, both in the Republic and in the North, to explain how difficult travel is, to explain that if you are living in a jurisdiction of your own, in a community of your own, that you're entitled to be cared for within that jurisdiction, within that community. That, in my view, was one of the most difficult arguments. And in terms of who we still struggle to make that argument for, racial minorities in Ireland. That's, that's a really interesting one, because in Ireland and Northern Ireland, we like to think of ourselves as the colonized, and we don't like to think about our role in colonization, except perhaps in quite a romantic way around World War I. I say romantic as in like death cult, but like romantic, right? I mean, the Irish as white citizens, or potentially white citizens of empire, were part of colonial civil service, were part of colonial police forces, were instrumental in settler colonization across the former British Empire, and most importantly, perhaps through this, the literal civilizing mission of Catholic missionary organizations, provided healthcare, provided training, provided education. And so inward migration to Ireland has been connected to that. People come from countries where there were strong Irish governmental presences. And in the 50s and 60s, it was of a different nature by and large. And this is, we've been thinking about that in relation to the mother and baby homes as well. Students came to learn to be doctors and lawyers and civil servants, and then they went back and they used that education, similar to kind of the British university industrial complex at the moment, right? In the 1990s, the nature of that migration changed in a number of ways, but the most important was the people expected to stay. And Ireland's current mode of managing immigration is profoundly racist, relies on institutionalization. And it's been really interesting to see how that has interacted with abortion discourse. There's two things to point out, maybe. One was in the Mother and Baby Homes report, one of the chapters was called Pregnant from Ireland, PFI. PFI was an acronym that British social workers used to use to describe Irish women who didn't want to be institutionalized, couldn't deal with being a single mother at home, and wanted to come to Britain to have the baby or maybe to raise the baby. And they would be sent back. There were organizations, private organizations with state cooperation, which would send those women back so that they could be dealt with at home. And a few years before repeal, we heard the story of a woman known only as Miss Y, who was living in Ireland's asylum seeker detention system, which is called euphemistically direct provision. And she managed to get to Liverpool. She was interviewed for an hour or so, and she was turned around. I think she came via Northern Ireland, if I remember. That I may not be right on that, but she was sent back. She was sent back. And so these new systems for control of mobility, they're still there, right? It's just that they're racialized. And many people will know, perhaps people are surprised when they learn this or perhaps not, but that it was migrant women whose bodies were very much to the fore of campaigning. People like Savita Halappanavar and so on were very much literally the faces, that Savita Halappanavar's face was everywhere on posters, on pictures, on campaigning materials of this. Maybe the only thing I suppose that's helpful about organizing around abortion from a decolonial or post-colonial, whatever perspective, is there are things in terms of community knowledge and intergenerational knowledge. There are skills and attitudes that pass or can pass through parts of a colonized society that are terribly useful in the context of pro-choice organizing. One, I suppose, is, certainly was very helpful for us, particularly in the Republic, but not only in the Republic, to be able to talk in nationalist terms about abortion law as an aspect of liberation. Like one of the annual marches for choice, the one in 2016, which was the centenary of the 1916 Rising, very deliberately used those motifs and very deliberately interrogated histories, misogynist histories in Ireland, and kind of said, well, it's the centenary now, this was supposed to be our liberation, it isn't, and abortion is one of those key examples of our failure to fully emancipate ourselves. That discourse was really useful. But what's perhaps more useful is, as to just finish by echoing what Naomi was saying, is our comfort with disobedience, which is stronger in the North than it is in the South for obvious reasons, but our comfort with law-breaking and self-organizing and providing for ourselves because we can't expect the state to. The reason, of course, that's stronger in Northern Ireland is because, like, the visibility and the impact and the violence of colonization is vividly in more recent memory. I spoke to Emma Campbell a few years ago, who's a colleague, a comrade of Naomi's, and asked her about, distributing abortion pills illegally, theoretically, of course, and said, did you care? Were you not afraid? What did you think about doing this being illegal? And she said, you have to remember, when I was a kid, when I was a teenager, you couldn't go into the center of the city I lived in to go to the shops without passing through a checkpoint, a soldier's checkpoint. I did not grow up to think that the law was on my side. I didn't think that then, and I don't think it now. So why would I invest my emotional energy in the law? I'm going to invest my emotional energy in providing for people. And so all of those techniques, particularly in the North and around the sort of border areas, those techniques of dodging and smuggling are helpful theoretically. They were also helpful practically back when abortion was effectively banned and banned more heavily in the South than in the North. And we actually did have to rely on Northern Irish activists at various points to make sure that the pills got in. So these kinds of I think that it's a good thing you kind of asked us to reflect on it from in this way, because colonization isn't, this isn't going to be my my pitch for colonization as a useful educational method, right? But I think there is something about consciously thinking our way through some of that heritage and recognizing that, some of what is grieved on our behalf by a certain kind of British feminist doesn't really need grieving at all. It has made it possible for Irish women to survive and Northern Irish women to survive and support each other in very difficult, but at the same time, ways that are worth celebrating, I think. Yeah, let's end it there.
Thank you, Mairead. So I'm gonna kind of lean this into the question and answer segment. Before I do that, I realized that I didn't actually give Mairead a biography.
Nobody cares, least of all me. No, it's fine. It's fine.
Well, I did want to tell everybody that if you're interested in the Feminist Judgments project that Mairead is doing, you can go online to feministjudging.ie and you can explore some of this other work. So I want to go into the Q&A. We have a couple of questions. First of all, before we do that, just a couple of points of clarifications. Firstly, there was a question in the chat about the Holy Roman Empire. I wanted to take this as an opportunity to just tell you how complicated this actually is. The Holy Roman Empire does not match modern definitions of what an empire actually looks like in many different forms, right? Like there was an emperor, there were all these German princes and stuff like that. So as a result, it couldn't really pass laws in the institutional way that a lot of people are today used to. It was an extremely complicated political situation in Central Europe. In many ways, it parallels Afghanistan today. I could just be saying that to make Afghanistan seem more interesting because it makes me seem more interesting, but it was a very, very unique legal situation. The Ottoman Empire, was also very interesting because the Ottoman Empire did take moves towards natalism, that is, restricting abortion towards the very end. But when it did that, it was part of a general reforming of the empire to bring it closer to European lines, right? So I wanted to speak through that to another question about Europeanism and a progressive sense of empire. I mean, I think this is something that everybody needs to take away from this, right? Is that it used to be progressive to restrict abortion, that was the argument. It also used to be progressive to be homophobic. It also used to be progressive to tell trans people they couldn't exist, right? It's only very recently, historically, that you have this position that Europe is progressive in this other way that is opposed to the more conservative position that existed before, right? So it would be a mistake to think that simply imitating Europe is the way to, forward with this stuff, right? Because forward when it comes to abortion law means different things at different points. It used to be forward thinking to restrict abortion for many of the reasons that were detailed in this by the panelists, right? So kind of resist thinking about things in terms of okay, so we have to take a position we as forward-thinking people need to take a position that progresses everyone forward on abortion, right? I wish it was that easy, but thinking like that could easily get you into a situation where in 60 years, another Zainab, perhaps my clone or whatever, could be holding another talk and being yeah, can you believe that these people in the 2020s thought that this was progressive, right? Now this is progressive right now in 2085 or something, right? So try to think about things in non-linear ways, without thinking about this is better, this is more progressive. Especially for British and American viewers, that genuinely is a holdover from imperial privilege at the end of the day, right? Just a couple of things before we go into the next question. Firstly, there's been a question in the chat about US financing and abortion. Naomi touched on this. For those of you who are interested in the United States, what I'll say here is that there were two amendments, budgetary amendments passed in the 1970s. One of them was called the Hyde Amendment, which a lot of people in the American case know about. The Hyde Amendment prevents federal funding in the United States through Congress to be used for abortions. What a lot of people don't know about, and also speaks more directly to what Naomi was saying, is that the Hyde Amendment came after another amendment that was passed earlier, very soon after the Roe versus Wade case. And the Helms Amendment restricted for US budgetary funding through the federal government to be used in the context of international development for abortions, right? So you have a couple of things going on here, right? The reason that you're restricting funding for abortion in these cases from the federal government in the United States is because it forces clinicians to be very careful about where their money is coming from, right? So it means that abortion provision is much harder, but it also means that you need this really complicated financial structure in individual clinics to make sure that the money from the United States government isn't going to the wrong place. And the way that lended itself eventually into restricting federal funding locally within the United States is that it started through USAID, through the US Agency for International Development, right? So again, you have an imperial situation here, right? Classically, where restrictions in one place very quickly form the architecture for new restrictions more closer to home, right? And you figure out the specifics in abroad before you can like roll it out closer to home for a bunch of different reasons. Finally, there was a question about like the DUP and its relationship to the English crown. I was wondering if somebody could like speak a little bit more specifically on that, because like the DUP does like say a lot about like the royal family specifically, and like how does that like impact discussions of nationalism and masculinity and sexual reproduction and so on. Anyone can jump in.
Okay, I'm happy to jump in. Well, the DUP have a strange relationship with Westminster and the UK, in that they are a pro-unionist party. They celebrate the crown and everything that goes with that. Suffice to say, since they showed up in Westminster and had a strange coalition with the Tory government, which is now dissolved. People, when Alliance for Choice went to the UK to different things like the Labour Party conference and to speak at different things, the UK saw the DUP as they hadn't before. And the DUP, because they were partners with the Conservative government, had a UK platform that they didn't before. So lots of people in the UK were saying to us, what about the DUP? They're really ultra conservative. And we said, yeah, we know we have them all the time. You know, we just don't have them on certain things. But so there's an uneasy relationship, and the relationship is complex because the DUP will often vote against things in Westminster, and I would say that in ways that maybe a Conservative government or socially liberal, not economically, but socially liberal, that the DUP are not. They absolutely are not. So they reject things like equal marriage. They reject the Westminster legislation on abortion, but they still do it under a lot of paternalistic and with a lot of paternalistic and patriarchal emphasis. So they will say things like abortion is a conscience issue and it's a sensitive issue, but this is not true. The legislation should transcend that, but in Northern Ireland it doesn't. And really, when they're talking about conscience and sensitivity, it's a fig leaf for misogyny, for stigma, for secrecy, and for the patriarchal structures. So I think that's even more deplorable, that they're using this paternalistic approach and this idea of protecting women and pregnant people. They wouldn't recognize pregnant people. They've tried to sort of poke fun at that, and they've tried to deny it, and it's something that they've been vocal about. But this idea that the DUP are they are royalists, there's no doubt about that. But at times the relationship is uneasy, and I think it's fair to say that people in Westminster raise an eyebrow, a privileged one at that, but nonetheless raise an eyebrow at the DUP at times. But they are very much pro-union and pro-loyalist.
Okay, great. Thank you for that, Naomi. So jumping to the next question here, we have Josh Kiddo. So how intimately connected is class and empire in this divide between British and Irish feminism? Irish feminist organizations appear more focused on the material delivery of healthcare and ways in which working people can struggle to afford healthcare, and in Josh's opinion, therefore become more amenable to wider discussions on trans-appropriate measures and reproductive healthcare and so on. So how much is this related to different categories of class and empire, and how does that affect feminist debates in these two contexts? Like, if it does at all. Like, so why don't we get the panelists involved? You can jump in, like, as you see fit.
I'll do it. Okay, so sorry, can I just clarify what I think the question is? Is the question about why within abortion rights movements in Ireland and Northern Ireland, the idea of saying pregnant people and thinking about trans healthcare is less of a flashpoint? Is that the question? Like, is the question like, is that about class and empire, or is that about a more materialist feminism?
It's both. The question is, as I understand it, is like, does class and empire manifest in different kinds of ways, which would include trans inclusivity? Okay.
I think there are two interconnected things going on there. One is the distinction, One is the distinction between grassroots feminist organizing and lawmaking with a feminist identity. There's a much longer story we could tell about how, and maybe this is more of a story about the Republic, but like how the abortion law in the Republic actually changed. It was, you know, there's decades of grassroots organizing, much of which is very consciously socialist, working class, diverse. And I mean, sorry, diverse, that's going to contradict what I was just about to say, so let me start again. Just conscious of the value of difference to organizing in community, let's say it that way. But to get it over the line, all kinds of neoliberal feminist things need to happen. And there were a plurality of discourses that got repeal and got abortion law over the line. So it's not true to say that there's something, if a feminism is Irish, then it is class conscious or it is whatever, right? That's not what's happened. And one of the deficiencies that I think any of us or any of the people we hang out with would recognize was that, you know, we got abortion rights, but we didn't get reproductive justice. We got abortion rights at the same time that, you know, poverty for single parent headed households was increasing. We have huge problems with homelessness. We have huge problems with our treatment of migrants and their families and so on, right? So it wouldn't be true to say that Ireland is better than Britain in that sense. As an aside, you know, when we say Irish feminists versus English or British feminists, first of all, if we're talking about Northern Ireland, that distinction doesn't make sense. But second of all, like, which feminists? Who are you talking about? There are, you know, so it's more about, there's a question there about who's vocal and who's platformed. But maybe the nub of the issue for me, and I think a lot of people say this as well, I think the trans healthcare thing is not such a big issue in Ireland, even at the legislative level, because of course, we've had recent legal change, not ideal legal change, but palpable legal change in that area. Is there has always been, there's a long history of solidarity between gay and feminist organizing, queer and feminist organizing in Ireland. And it has centered around that experience of trying to assert bodily and sexual autonomy in a heavily religious environment. And that solidarity and that connection has been essential to organizing, particularly in more hostile contexts, when, like, if you wanted, you know, the first March for Choice was really small. If you were going to say to, you know, if you were going to choose who got to go out marching in that hostile environment on the basis of kind of their ideas about gender, you were going to be in a very lonely little knot, you know. So that solidarity is longer, is deeper rooted. And I think what's going on in Britain in terms of feminist attitudes to trans rights and so on, I think it's more it's more parochial than that. It has more to do with intergenerational conflicts and particular political movements that are very British and have a very British history. So no, we're not pro-trans because we're really good socialists. We're pro-trans because we're recovering Catholics, maybe. I don't know. But it wouldn't have been coherent. You can't go out there yelling "my body, my choice" and then 2 years later say, "but not your body and not your choice," right? It just doesn't make sense. So there's a question about the kind of intellectual integrity that was characteristic of that movement. I think when you take the kind of fire and urgency away, though, it would be interesting to see if that holds. And maybe that's what's happened in some British circles, right? If the urgency of the demand and how difficult it was to make it, much less succeed with it, if that is no longer part of your recent living memory, then maybe there's more space for fragmentation. I don't know. But at the moment, that's how most people explain the difference between how we talk about trans rights in Ireland and how they're increasingly being spoken about in a certain kind of space, well-platformed space in Britain. England, I shouldn't have said Britain, England.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. So we have another question, and then we can probably do one more before we retire. It's a weird word to use for that. So how important is a gendered lens to economic recovery emerging from the pandemic, and how can a gendered lens also be used in order to discuss reproductive health rights as they relate to COVID-19?
I'm happy to take that if Helen doesn't want to come in, but sure.
No, I'm
Okay.
I'm happy for you to do it. I'm quite sleepy.
Okay. Well, I think in terms of a recovery to a gendered recovery to economy, it has to be done through a gendered lens, because cuts are gendered, austerity is gendered, and if we look at the impact of that, so that the rollout of cuts in welfare, cuts in childcare, cuts in education, not exclusively, but predominantly affected women, and more so women and people in particular marginalised groups. Then the second effect of cuts in services, especially when it comes to health cuts and cuts in care services, is the reality that women, through unpaid domestic labour, will pick up the slack where the cuts have taken hold. So if there's a cut to someone's care package in the community, it is women who will usually step in to that shortfall. And when you look I work as a trade unionist, that's kind of what I do during the day, among other things. But the impact of redundancies, especially during the pandemic, usually the first things to go are part-time jobs in care services, and jobs in public services are usually the first thing the federal governments will look to in order to implement cuts and measures of austerity. And in and around 60 or 70% of people employed in those services are women. So they will feel the brunt of redundancies and cuts in those areas. And then on top of that, the first thing to go when it comes to, even if you look at the pandemic, the first thing that they will look to when it comes to health cuts are sexual health and reproductive services. So contraception, abortion services, advice services for things like LGBTQI people, all those things are the soft underbelly of public services, and seen, despite the fact they're so widely used, despite the fact 1 in 3 to 4 women and pregnant people will have an abortion in their lifetime, that's the first thing to go. And we felt the effect of that in Northern Ireland during the pandemic. We've been denied abortion telemedicine, but 2 of the health trusts have removed their early medical abortion service. So the Northern Health Trust, which is one of the most affected areas when it comes to COVID in Europe, not just in Ireland, in Europe, the Northern Trust had to cut their early medical abortion services. They reinstated it last week, and the next day the Southeastern Trust removed their early medical abortion services as a consequence of the pandemic. So unless you're looking at that through a gendered lens, you're not going to get the solutions to it. You're not going to say, well, these are the groups of people that it's impacting, and this is what we need to do. Sorry, I can't recall the other part of the question. My apologies for that. Was there another part to it, Zainab?
No, yeah, no, that was basically it. Thank you for that comprehensive response. Like, I was hoping to end this with a question about racial minorities, and their symbolic role in the Irish abortion debate. I mean, this is a really interesting case. I've talked to a lot of people about it, including in Sinn Féin and whatnot. I don't really know how to channel this question properly, but basically, the question is there were significant cases involving people who weren't Irish Protestant and weren't Irish Catholic that ended up having a significant impact on the evolution of the Irish abortion debate into the recent legal and referendal changes. And so can any of you explain what actually happened there, right? Was the fact that they were racial minorities, did that mean that they could be taken up as symbolic in the abortion debate more so than if they were straddling the Protestant v Catholic divide? Is the fact that these people were at once outside of that debate, did that mean that there were things that could be done by campaigners with those cases and by news media with those cases so that they ended up having this symbolic role? Would that have happened if they were Protestant or Catholic and also white Irish?
I'm going to speak to that a little bit, although I'm very conscious of being, I think the case that we all kind of perhaps first think of is the death of Savita Halapanova from a miscarriage. I think part of the reason that these cases became so prominent is partly what you're talking about that symbolism and about how it is easier to perhaps reify someone that we're not expecting to hear from, that we're not, we're used to Irish people talking about this question. But I also think that we've got to remember it's because they're more likely to be subject to the violence in this system. Savita Halapanova was told by a nurse, this is a Catholic country. She had to be told. She didn't know. Ms. Y was an asylum seeker and was therefore in a less privileged position than, for example, I would be had I been in her situation and needing an abortion. White settled Irish people know what to do, knew what the paths were and what the options were if they needed abortions. Migrant and racialized people obviously did not necessarily have that history. Does that make sense? And that they are therefore more subject to the problems of our thing. There's a statistic, and I'm probably going to get this wrong, but 40% of our maternal deaths are migrant or racialized women or non-white Irish, and that is not 40% of our population or 40% of people who give birth. It is a shocking statistic. And I think it is partly that these things would not have happened to white Irish women. I think that there is absolutely a symbolic element, but I also think we wouldn't have had those cases in the same way. And I think we have to remember that as well.
Anyone else have anything to say on that?
Yeah, it might be worth saying as well that it's not that these things had not happened to white Irish women. It was that when they did happen, they happened to women who either died and so couldn't speak out, or to young girls who were in the official care of the state. And so, who had been taken into care at a young age and who would have been, who were prevented from speaking out about it either ever or until they reached adulthood and were no longer, their communication was no longer being kind of mediated by social workers. So there are different forms of marginalization, but what Helen says is exactly right. And particularly when you bear in mind that the 8th Amendment wasn't an abortion ban as such, it was a fetal life amendment. So it was about balancing the right to life of the pregnant woman with the right to life of the fetus that she was carrying at all stages of pregnancy. So it affected all aspects of pregnancy right up until the moment, well, the end of labor, right? And so that's why Savita Halappanavar died of an inevitable, in the course of an inevitable miscarriage. And that's why it's that combination of things. It's the fetal life thing, which the marginalization thing, the likelihood of being able to advocate. What was interesting, though, in terms of Savita Halappanavar, was her husband Praveen and her friends, because she was Indian. They knew, and they were middle class, well-educated people, they knew that if they had still been in India, this would not be happening because Indian law was more liberal around abortion. And that was the cause of their confusion and his grief and his outrage. And he sort of gave television interviews very shortly afterwards when he was still visibly grieving. And that was very important because it was his shock, his incomprehension, that he just couldn't understand that this had happened to them and couldn't rationalize it. And also there were interviews with her parents, who also, despite being older people, could not understand it. And I think that was disruptive and also profoundly shaming, because, to see somebody's husband and parents speak out for them, that had very rarely happened. I think the last public example of that happening was a woman who died a really horrible death, I think in the weeks just before the 8th Amendment was passed. She was denied cancer treatment. She was denied bone cancer treatment because it would interfere with the growth of the fetus. And in the end, both she and the baby died. Sheila Hodgers, her husband Brendan, tried to speak out about her and was kind of silenced by the sort of cultural machine. And so the courage, actually, because he didn't have to, Praveen Halappanavar did not have to say anything. He didn't have to do that to himself. He didn't have to take up that kind of banner. And so, but what it might be worth saying as well is, we have had reform of the abortion law, strictly speaking. We haven't had reform around obstetric violence, maternity care, and so on. Because the issues, thinking about medical autonomy and so on, the autonomy of the medical professions and so on, despite our best efforts, the issues have still not been linked up. And so even though there is no 8th Amendment anymore, there hasn't been a radical revisiting of what it's permissible to do to a woman who's giving birth. We had not that long ago a citizenship referendum, which deprives children who are born to non-Irish parents of the automatic right to birth citizenship. And a lot of the discourse around that was around, what Americans might call the anchor baby discourse, people coming over here, having their babies here, looking for Irish citizenship, and they're not even Irish, kind of thing, It's a profoundly racist discourse. And so, yeah, those issues are very tightly tied up. And as Helen says, it's not a happy or symbolic story, actually. What made people so angry about it, if you look at people like Merge, Migrants and Ethnic Minorities for Reproductive Justice, was that, these stories were retold and used very effectively in certain media contexts without necessarily improving the lives of women who looked like the women who became the symbols of that struggle. And that's what you would expect in what is still a profoundly racist country, in the way that it's organized, in the way that it works. So
yeah. Can I just add to that as well, because I think it's important to highlight. Mairead was talking earlier about the fact that the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, the Westminster Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, just for people who are unaware who that is, the British Secretary of State. In addition to saying, and he did that's a direct quote. He did say when we discussed what the abortion regulatory framework in Northern Ireland was going to look like, and we said, well, we have the CEDAW compliant. you know, framework, and that's what you should work towards. He actually said to us, well, you're not going to get it all your own way, and we can't have Northern Ireland being in a better position than the rest of the UK. That's a direct quote. That's not an anecdote. But one of the other examples of where this is about institutional racism when it comes to abortion provision is the consultation itself, which was rolled out in Northern Ireland and was unprecedented. The consultation process was not necessary. But when we approached the Secretary of State and the Northern Ireland office to say, what are you going to do to equality proof access to abortion healthcare? They didn't know what we meant. They said, what do you mean by that? And we said, for example, women and pregnant people in migrant communities who already have access barriers when it comes to healthcare, what are you going to do? Have you considered that as part of the consultation process? Given that that was the premise of the consultation process. The premise of the consultation process was rolled out apparently to make sure it was equality proofed, to make sure that women and pregnant people who had disabilities, who were in migrant communities, who were from LGBTQ communities, to make sure that the healthcare provision was adequate for them. They didn't know what we meant when we used the example of women and pregnant people from migrant communities. We said, what about language barriers? What about access? What about the fact that they're not sure about their status? Have you considered race and all of these things? And they drew a blank. They drew a blank. So that wasn't only disingenuous, that was institutional neglect of race as an issue in abortion access. Sorry, I just wanted to add that comment because it struck us at the time negatively, and it sort of made us realize that our hopes for the regulatory framework were soon to be dashed, and they were.
Thank you very much for that. We're gonna wrap up the talk now. Thank you very much to the panelists. This was an extremely interesting discussion. Thank you to all the attendees. I hope that you got something out of this. And please stay tuned to the Learning Co-operative, which will be discussing abortion and empire in various different ways. And I really hope that these connections that everyone has made will result in something greater and lovely. And I personally look forward to speaking to the panelists at different things in the coming months and years. So thank you very much, everybody. And I really hope that you have an excellent day.